St. Juan's home for the ADD.
Hey there, it's Quan3217 bringing you episode 4 of Bring Your Own Com. Well, we have a look at the tracking station here, and we've got one sandstone in orbit. And one thing that we notice about it is that there's no funny green lines connected to it. That means it is completely out of contact. And in between episodes, I noticed that there is a difficulty setting. In fact, if you watch the very end of the last episode very carefully, you'd see that we still had minimal control over it, and that's cheating. So I changed one of the settings so that now when you're out of contact, you have no probe control whatsoever. So what we're going to do is we're going to use another chain of sandstones, except one of the things that we bought with our science that we just got, I'm not going to make you watch me test every part on the pad, but we collected some science and we collected some funds, and so with our space bucks we bought this new relay antenna, and we're going to make an upgraded X-ray here. Now our naming convention is that we don't change the name of the rocket if the payload changes. So we can put whatever the heck we want on top of an X-ray, and it's still an X-ray. So we can change the antenna, we can change all this good stuff, and it's still a sandstone X-ray. So, and that's what we're doing here. And now our communication strategy, we could do two things. We could put a whole chain of these things in low Kerbal orbit. Any one of them, if they're about equally spaced, and I figure you have about 7 or 8 of them, then you'll have a string of pearls all the way around Kerbal, and one of them will always be over the Space Center, or at least over the horizon at the Space Center, and it'll give comm to all the others. You could do that, or we could go with the Arthur C. Clarke route. We'll take 3 of these things and we'll put them in a much higher orbit. Just for tradition, we'll go ahead and we'll put these in as accurate as possible of a Kerbal synchronous orbit. We'll put 3 of them up there, make a nice little equilateral triangle, and the way that the geometry of this system works, it's just like Earth in that 3 satellites still have contact with each other. With 3 satellites, they can all see each other and they're not looking through the horizon, and each one of them covers almost a full hemisphere, and so with the 3, you get almost complete coverage over the entire surface of the planet, except for a small region of each pole. And up in space, it's even better. You get pretty much complete coverage. Now this is what NASA does with the TDRS satellite, the Tracking and Data Relay Satellite. And in effect, that's what we're doing here, is we're building our own tracking and data satellite network. And the way that NASA does it is they have two satellites that are visible from their ground station in New Mexico. One's way over in the east and one's way over in the west. And with those 2, they can get coverage of the entire low Earth orbit except for one little band on the opposite side from New Mexico where they don't get any coverage. And what they do nowadays is that they have several other TDRS satellites and a ground station in the Pacific such that they can get full coverage no matter what. So these first 2 satellites we put into a low Kerbal orbit first. This is a pretty traditional strategy for real-world communication satellite launchers. They will launch from Florida, and Florida isn't right over the equator, and for various reasons we'll get to, you want to put your transfer orbit perigee at the equator. And so they launch into a parking orbit and get to the equator, and then there's this area right over the Gulf of Guinea off the coast of Africa. And way over their head is where all the transfer burns begin. And so we're going to do the same thing here, except the first satellite that we put up hasn't even completed a full orbit yet, and we're already putting up the second one. That's one of the wonderful things about Kerbal, is that you can skip time and that you can build spacecraft and satellites and rockets instantly and roll them out to the pad. If it happens in Kerbal, it happens in real life. If we die in Kerbal, we die in real life, and if this happens, then this happens. So we will take full advantage of it. And so we perform the second burn here to circularize, and then we get ready to plan our next orbiter. Since we're changing more than the payload on this one, we'll actually justify giving this a different series name. So what we're doing, we're going to take the swivel off of this and we're going to put a Terrier on instead. It's a lot lower thrust, but it's a lot better specific impulse. And especially once we get in space and we start doing our maneuvers, we don't need a lot of thrust. Some of these huge spacecraft have engines that have main engines that they use after they drop off the launch vehicle that have only 100 pounds of thrust. Now 100 pounds of thrust working on a 5,000 pound spacecraft, it's not very much get up and go, so they typically have burns that are 5, 10, 20 minutes. The Galileo orbiter entering the orbit of Jupiter used one of these tiny insignificant little engines. I think it's like the size of an ant or something. And it just burned for 45 minutes and it was able to enter orbit around another planet with it after it was kicked into interplanetary space by the space shuttle and then an upper stage booster. So we'll go ahead and launch Sandstone Yoke and put it into orbit. And we're going to try something different on this one. We're going to skip the parking orbit phase and we're just going to keep burning it until the apogee gets the Apple curve gets all the way up to our our Kerbal-synchronous orbit altitude. I'm going to keep calling this thing Geo all day long, aren't I? Well, so be back with you when this thing gets into orbit. Apologies for the lighting on this one. So we've made it into orbit now, but we're going to keep on burning because that's what we got to do in order to get into transfer orbit. It's dark because it's dark. Kerbal Space Center. Oh, that's no good. Yeah, you see up there, you see that nice little red indicator? We have no control over this guy anymore. And it's just going to keep burning and burning its engines until it runs out of gas or until we get back into contact with it. And since we don't have any other assets that can get back into contact with it, it's just going to keep going and going and going and going. Well, it never did run out of gas. Let's see where we ended up. Did we end up in orbit? No, we got a pretty clean escape. All the way out in interplanetary space, and let's see where... Man, maybe we even escaped the system entirely. Yeah, it doesn't look like it. Nope, we got an apogee about 67 years from now. Okay, well... we shall call you Artificial Comet 1. And in the meantime, X-Ray 1 has finally come back into contact with the Space Center, so it's time to set up its transfer burn into Kerbal transfer orbit. So we add some prograde to this thing, and we want its apogee to be right at 2863.3 kilometers above the surface. A circular orbit at that altitude has a period of exactly 5 hours, 59 minutes, and 9.4 seconds. This is the exact amount of time it takes for Kerbin to rotate. Now, you might think, well, Kerbin rotates in 6 hours. And you'd be right, and wrong. You might think that the Earth takes 24 hours to rotate, and you'd be right and wrong. Both of those numbers are with relation to the Sun, and that makes sense because we count 24 hours from noon to the next noon. And on Kerbal, the Kerbals count 6 hours from noon to the next noon. But during the day, each planet goes a little bit away around in its orbit, so it has to turn a little bit further to get back to pointing at the Sun. So the solar day is a little bit longer than the time it takes to rotate relative to the stars. and it's like sidereal or something. It's one of those words that is all too common in astrodynamics that I've heard, that I've never heard, and I've only read. And so I don't know how it's really pronounced. Anyway, if you do the orbit math, you figure out that the exact altitude that you need is, like I said, 2863.3 kilometers, which gives you one sidereal day. And that's what we've done. We've boosted this guy up into a transfer orbit with the perigee at that altitude. Far too late to do anything about it. We've reestablished contact with the artificial comet. We will just let it keep going because it can't do anything about it. What we'll do instead is we will start to set up the transfer burn for our other good stay-at-home twin, X-Ray 2. And we're going to put this one about 120 degrees away. We'll move its periaps out, and we'll get this nice little flower. We'll get this nice little 3-leaf clover with Kerbal at the center. And look at that, X-Ray 1 and the artificial comet are still talking to each other, but that doesn't help either of them because they're not in contact with the ground station. What we're going to plan right now is a circularization maneuver, and since circularization is a 6-syllable word, they like to call it the kick maneuver. We just give our spacecraft a kick in the apogee. That's really the technical term for it at Earth. So you'll see on a spacecraft they have an apogee kick motor, a perigee kick motor, especially on the space shuttle. They throw a satellite overboard on the space shuttle, and it was intended for geosynchronous orbit. And they'd use the perigee kick motor, which was sticking out the back, to get it up into transfer orbit. And this perigee motor was a very carefully calibrated solid fuel motor. And then once they got up to apogee, they'd fire an apogee kick motor, which is usually a liquid fuel rocket, and they used to do all the other orbit changes with it. And so we get our apogee kick planned here, and we set the timer so that we don't forget, because otherwise I know that I will forget. And we'll go ahead and turn up the thrust on this thing, because while it's convenient for maneuvering purposes to keep it all the way down as low as you can for accuracy, if it takes 10 minutes to do your maneuver, that's not going to be accurate either. So we pick a healthy compromise. I usually like to have maneuvers no shorter than about 10 seconds. So then we use the alarm clock. Now, as you may have noticed, I'm using a couple of mods in this game, and I would say that they don't increase the power at all. They just make things a little bit easier and more convenient. One is the engineering module, which gives on the right here all these nice little numbers relating to the orbit, and up there on top with the HUD you can see it even during launch. You can see what your apogee will be at any moment when you cut thrust. And then the other one that we use is the Kerbal alarm clock, and I really want to thank Scott Manley for this one. He was telling all of his viewers about how he wouldn't be able to do all of these missions at once without the alarm clock. And I got to agree with him. This thing really helps to keep things straight, keep our schedule. It works lots of spacecraft at once, and when something's coming up on one spacecraft, you can go jump to it. Now I've got this apogee kick planned, but there's no guarantee that we will be in range of the Space Center when it comes around. So we just take a chance. If it works on that apogee kick, then we do it. And if it doesn't, then we wait till the next orbit. Now, usually when they draw diagrams of what a transfer orbit looks like, they'll show the orbit going exactly halfway around from low Earth orbit up to geosynchronous orbit, implying that they do the apogee kick exactly half an orbit afterwards. But I happen to know that's not true. The spacecraft could ride around the transfer orbit many times before it fires its apogee kick motor. And if that's the case with ours, then that's what it'll be. So here we got Yoke 2 going on, and with X-Ray in its transfer orbit, it's already doing its communications mission. So We're a little bit safer here. We're a little bit more comfortable with not creating artificial Comet 2. And so we do the launch. We finish the boost at first apoapse, but this time we're not going to plan to burn all the way into transfer orbit. We're just going to burn into a low Kerbal orbit so that we can get that third petal of our three-leaf clover. So you see all that communication there. And a lot of it is actually provided by yoke 1 or by yoke 2, even though it isn't even in orbit yet. Yoke 2 is actually providing service to X-ray rather than the other way around. Well, we'll go ahead and finish the low Kerbal orbit insertion maneuver and get this thing into a parking orbit. And now we've got that great trefoil that we expected. And we've got 3 satellites in orbit and 1 headed out towards the great beyond. And that'll do it for this episode. So this has been Quan3217 saying if at first you don't succeed, fly, fly again.